Welcome to your second lecture of HPH 245, Hispanic Heritage in the Southwest. And now we have been familiar with the Canvas modules. Probably this is your second module, so this goes over 2 weeks. So in this lecture, what you are going to see, first of all, is divided into two parts. The first part, we're going to see some terminology and a bit of a panning through the Southwest and its history. One of the key elements here would be a timeline that we will be going back to. Um, how one of our main dates will be 1492 as and one of the key people that we will be referring to will be Columbus, but we will see this further down the lecture. The first part I want to emphasize is this first um, slide with a bit of imagery of what our semester is going to look like. First, we have some uh, soldaderas on the left hand side, and soldaderas are women that fought in the Mexican Revolution, and some imagery, some paintings that we will look in more depth throughout the semester, and also some pre-Hispanic imagery that also will be referring to throughout the lecture. So this for the first part of the lecture is going to be mostly around history and how we understand history. One thing, we separate history versus past. And this is the same idea as thinking of reality and what we could record of reality. So let's say the past, could be vast, and it'll be impossible to take everything that happened in X amount of time and record every single event. And there'll be um, many and many libraries to hold that information, even computers. So it'll be impossible. But history is rather recording of somewhat putting that timeline, events, piling them up, and somewhat viewing what is important politically, economically, socially, that would take the world's history a certain way and shape or form. So we will be focusing in many discourses about the world. Um, so we will view it from one side or the other side, meaning one side, for example, one event that comes to mind is the annexation of Texas, of what we know of Texas, to American expansionism. Um, how, and from one side, it would be that independence from Mexico, and from the other side would be uh, the annexation of. So one would be losing a territory, as the other side would view it as the acquisition, because they wanted their own independence. So, and that will be reviewed in one very interesting documentary I have prepared for you in the near future. So, historians do choose what to write. We have heard the saying, history is written by the victor, and that's the history we inherit from them. Even though there is certain areas of revisionism, um, my role here is to show you the documents uh, for you to understand, to analyze, rationalize, and then you could see all this information that is meshed together, somewhat separated, distinct, distinct from one to the other, uh, give hierarchy to these narratives, and then hopefully analyze and rationalize what makes sense to you. There's different research methods will approach, and I'm from a school of very formalist education, so I will probably have this timeline, and I will maintain it throughout the semester, and having that date that is very important, 1492 to us, and then how the myth develops from there. But once you're familiar with the text, like I said before, you'll be able to question it and do a bit more with it. All right. So in practice, we're gonna see what we learn, what we can remember, what we believe we know about Columbus, certain holidays that are important for us as a society, what is not as important, and why it should be. And we'll talk about this importance throughout the lecture. For now, let's one of the main things is tying together the history that we have of the Southwest and tying it together to the cultural production. And by cultural production, I mean the music, film, literatures that come with the Southwest, and how this cultural production has given us an idea of what the Southwest is and is ingrained in our psyche, and how certain things were avoided and hidden from us. And so, more than anything, we'll start with this idea of identity. Of identity, we've probably heard words like being Chicano, being Latino, being Mexican American, being Colombiano, Salvadoreño, and whatnot, especially living in this Southwest, being so rich in culture. Then this, I bring to you this bit of a lecture that is online. You can see the link up on the left hand side, and you will see how it questions this the true Mexican and how it is defined. What is a true anything? For example, un buen mexicano, a good Mexican does A, B, and C. But culturally, there's certain traits that he or she has inherited to be that Mexicano. Same thing with the Southwest. Mexico Americano, second generation of Mexican fathers from certain social class that migrated to the U.S. Third generation Mexican, or let's not go that far, even the first one. And let's just remember that migration doesn't only happen from Mexico, but from all over the world. Uh, Central America, South America, and let's think also Spain and the rest of the world. We're just meshing everything together. So there's nothing such a culturally pure. There's nothing as the so pure race that some would actually see as perfection. And this documentary, you should this documentary, or not documentary, but this lecture, you could check out the first 27 minutes to get this idea of the pure, culturally pure, which ties everything together, and so being so relevant even today. So I encourage you to watch this first part and to continue the rest of the lecture. Um, so we go back and we look at a few maps for this. For one, I would like to. We already talked about routes and first Americans. I'm looking at the left map, and how some theories do say that this first Americans do come from Asia, from Siberia and whatnot, and they enter from the north and they spread out south. this other region map on the left hand side, we see the different regions, how it was divided from the southeast, the northeast, the Great Plains, how it's part of Texas, the southwest, how it also touches somewhat of that Texas, New Mexico, what we know today as New Mexico, even some Arizona, and then on the left hand side we have most of the Californias, the the Bajas, and the well known as California, the state of the one of the 50 states of the U.S. But the concept of borders, it is an idea that we created borders for political, and that political definition, that political expansion of a nation. And we'll see how the United States begins with that expansion from the east and keeps on growing, and how it acquired much of the territory of what we know that is, and that it was Mexico's, or it was a colony of Spain, and how once Mexico had um, such property, then how it shifted from being belonging to one country to the other. And then we will revise different documents, especially the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which it was drafted after the Mexican-American War, and how most of that territory was lost. And that's one of the documents we'll be looking at in the near future. So we see how this idea of borders from 1492 up to 1890 starts developing. 1492, that being that key date of the American quote-unquote discovery that Columbus was big part of. And then we start seeing this expansion, and we'll talk more about this. This is a very interesting map, Little Indian Man Sessions animation that we have on the right hand side of the screen. And then 1492, 1790, some of the colonies 1830. By the end of the 19th century, now we see the United States how we know it today. Mexican territory and cultural overlap. So we probably have heard the saying, the border, I did not cross the border crossed us. And this is what we talked about last semester in another class. And this is exactly what it means, or at least alludes. And one of the, if we see the top left map, we see this Mexico as having that territory, even that goes all the way up to Wyoming, takes most, if not much, of Nevada, California, and how all this was even a bit down from the Oregon country. That now I'm looking at the right hand side map, the how we see how the U.S. territory on the right somewhat it's taking a bit of chunks until it develops of what the political map we know today, but still we don't see much of these maps today. They're a bit hidden, put away, because also they were somewhat of political discourse that probably the victor or the winning side does not want you to go back and revise, even though um, Mexican culture, Spanish culture was is embedded in this region. So going back at the border across us, it's talking about that generation of Spanish Mexican, that Mexican descents that were here before this political division. Many families were here from a Spanish ancestry and Mexican ancestry, and still many generations are still in the same area. They will not move, but somewhat we'll see what types of conflicts um, came about because of this. All right, now we could take a quick break. We'll just, after that little panning of history, we could take a few minutes, even a day, just pause it for a bit, and then we could go back and pick up. Okay, so after you hit pause, we could get started with the next lecture. Okay. So we're going to start with some of the empires that, for the most part, we're going to be emphasizing in the Southwest, and this being probably one of the central ones is going to be the Aztecs or the Mexica people. The Mexica are known as the Mexica, known as Aztecs. The Mexica people, usually that's where the word Chicano comes from. Mexica, Chicano, and there's a very famous playwright that goes over this, and we'll be viewing one of his documentaries throughout the semester, so you'll have a chance to see some of that history. And most of the history that we are able to get from these cultures are actually saved as a form of codices, and they're done by the Spaniards, where they asked a few people to tell their stories, a few Mexica people to tell their stories, and record the stories somewhat to that. Now they have created somewhat of that mythological a world where it's filled with pre-Hispanic symbolism, and where it really shows where there's this somewhat of a sophisticated culture. They're prosper. They had their own rules. They were at the top. They had social classes. They did have, for example, the Aztecs did have nobles. They had a military, clergymen, and whatnot. So they had not a monotheistic religion, but a polytheistic, where some of the um, signs clashed against the ones brought by Spain. One of the examples that I can think of is the serpent. The serpent, the serpiente emplumada, or the feather serpent, as the indigenous people saw it, Quetzalcoatl as this being of wisdom in the form of a serpent that flew by. The Spaniards had a different idea of the serpent, more of a Catholic Christian mythology, where the serpent was the somewhat in the Genesis, um, the beginning of evil, and the history, or actually the mythology behind Adam and Eve, and how he starts, or the serpent starts, uh, uh, to develop that mythology that end up in the expulsion of the two mythological men and women. So, going back to this myth, there's also that mythological, or that myth of the Aztecs, and not only talking about this Aztecs, we also have the Olmecas, the Zapotecas, the Mayas, and each one of them come from this myth. And it's one of the myths is clearly illustrated in this, the five suns, los cinco soles. I do have a bit of a video that I have a link on the bottom right of this slide, and you'll watch, try to watch the whole thing, if not the first 10 minutes. It's a animated, very colorful animation, where more than anything we see this creation of the world and the symbols behind it. We go back to the numerology, how we have the five suns, bit cyclical. You will see how some Tezcatlipocas represent different regions of the continent. How some of the yellow region is the region of light where the sun is born, the east, the black or the region of the thorns, smoking mirror, keeper of memory, Tezcatlipoca. For the red, we'll see what we talked about, Quetzalcoatl, keeper of intelligence, wisdom, women who die in childbirth, warriors, and whatnot. And then we have the white north of death, land, continual renewal. That you see this little graph, the medicine wheel does reflect this, which is really interesting. All right, so we think of America in that date 1492, but then we think before 1492. We have an Europe that somewhat is going through this renaissance, that innovation, that enlightenment period, where Spain, for the most part, did not see this exit of the medieval times until in the arts shown at 1499 with a very important play called La Celestina. And La Celestina is like that marks that division in between that medieval period and then that golden age. It happens 1499, a few years after the discovery of America, and we could see the wealth um, by the acquisition of America and the taking of all the products and the gold and whatever they could find, taken somewhat to. It just somewhat increased, and we could see it from that moment on. It could be like a little thermometer of wealth, if you may. So we do have these monarchs that are quite ambitious. They do want that expansionism, and it's an economical expansion. We understand that. There is many rivals that they see throughout the world. We have the main ones that we're going to be focusing on, and we'll see much of the colonies, is the English, France, and Spain, and also I forgot Portugal. So this travelers and navigators focusing on the Spanish and Portuguese, they wanted to find different routes. So that was the ambition, a monetary ambition, the expansionism ambition. So we have in this region of Spain and Portugal, which their reigns and the crowns united with the crown of Isabel and Ferdinand. And they still, once they united, they somewhat formed that first region of Castilla y Leon, Castile and Leon. But they knew they needed more to just have that region. They needed some more wealth. So they did wanted to find different routes. History does show us that Christopher Columbus, not very highly educated, but he was someone that had the ambition to look for different routes, and he had read that there would be a new route for Asia, and he in fact wanted to find India, so he went and did find different a different region, where he did find an exotic place in his mind. And there's a few documents, for example, the letter to Sant'Angel that we could probably share a copy, that does show how he encountered the Taínos and the Taínos in the island of Salvador, which is now Dominican Republic, Tahiti, that area. And now we could see the side of not only Spain, how economically was not at its best before 1492, but then we see this 1491 and before in the Americas how there is a society, there is a series of societies throughout America already developing, maybe in a different timeline as far as this Eurocentric view, this Eurocentrism as being in a higher realm for some scholars. But rather, there is also this America before 1492. There's this NPR interview that probably will somewhat give you a bit of an idea of how America was like before the Spaniards came about. There's different settlings around from north to south. So go ahead, go listen to this entire interview, and it'll give you um, probably I'll give you a different view of what America was like and all the exchanges between all the products that went back and forth. And one of the interesting things about this interview is about the sickness and the that were spread through America and what really somewhat influenced for the decay of certain cultures. So we go back to these explorers, or someone would say finders or stumblers upon. We have this character that will go back over and over throughout the semester, Christopher Columbus, um, Italian Italian descent. There's a dispute of different origins. He, like I said before, he was commissioned by Spain to find different routes. As one student put it, well, he was doing his job. He went, he was given some money, some crew, and he was sent off to find a different route so it would benefit the crown, the Spanish crown. So he did landed, like I said, in the Caribbean, in what we know, and he called it San Salvador, the savior island of Haiti, Dominican Republic, and then Cuba, Cuba. And like I said, he did took the Taínos as slaves. He does describe the Taínos as being very somewhat submissive in his letter. He somewhat portrays them as people that are very noble, nice, but no harm whatsoever. Somewhat as savages, even he describes them as somewhat of they would do no harm to to uh, to the Spanish crews. So this would Carta San Angel, which is a carta to the king, that would portray the indigenous people as not being of much. They would not put up a fight, basically. So he's either somewhat adored by some, hated by some. It all depends what view you have of him. So it's up to you after we go over some of the material to somewhat rationalize the figure of Columbus as a positive figure, negative figure. It's up to you. I only don't want to put my bias in here. So this is a figure we'll be going back to. The Spaniards, the Portuguese, we did have this Treaty of Tordesillas, which will be seeing this map. We do see that Spain and the expansion of Spain on the left-hand side, Central America, the Caribbean, some of the Florida area, and there's a few expeditions. But by 1550, this is what those expeditions have brought. Um, So there's a few things that I would like you to see. One of them, the coming of Cortés, Hernán Cortés, because one thing that will come up throughout the semester is the defeat of Tenochtitlan, the fall of the Aztec and the Incas by 1550, and what helped for this to happen. Also, how such an empire fell by the hand of Cortés, and how much Mexican symbolism it goes back to this time period, the 1550, with declaration of Cuauhtemoc. And if you watch the first 7 minutes, 7 8 minutes, we look back and see, why do we celebrate this time period, this Eurocentric view of America? Should we celebrate it? Should we not? So this gives to a great discussion, or rather, gives a good starting point for you to think where you stand. A bit of a conflict if you are 21st century Southwest resident. It makes you think, well, we wouldn't be here if these events would have not developed. Which you're right. Probably we would have. Probably this region would still be Mexico, and migration would not happen. But probably we would have been more in a place that it would be a lot colder than what Arizona is. So many different routes that the history would have taken us. So let's see what Spanish America, and by Spanish America, it's also somewhat of a synonym as Catholic Spanish America. And one of the evangelization, it was one of the main goals of the crown to have Catholic taxpayers, basically. And this is something we'll go over in more detail. All right, so for now I want you to go back and reflect upon this lecture and see some of these dates that are quite important, especially 1492, 1499, with the end of that medieval Spain, and where this will be developed into what we know of the Southwest today. For now, you have reached the end of this lecture. Congratulations, you've made it on one more lecture. We have a few more to go, so let's keep up with the material. You have a few assignments, and make sure that you find them. And if you have any more questions, please email me. You have my email, you have different ways to get a hold of me. Congratulations once again. I will see you next week. Thank you very much.